Okay. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast by former feds who got the fork out. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
Now, before we get started, make sure to hit the follow button.
You can find all our content and show notes on our website, forkingoff.com.
And if you enjoy what we do and want to help, consider supporting us on Ko-fi. Hi, we've got a great guest today, Alec Chapa, a former conciliator with DOJ's Community Relations Service. Before we hear from Alec, we wanted to highlight some data from OPM and some insight about all of the departures from federal service over the last year. Hey, Philip, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the data project you're working on?
I've read a lot of these stories about numbers on who left the government, how many people, which agencies were impacted. And I remember seeing back in January, OPM released data on all of the separations between January 2025 and January 2026.
Interesting.
Right? So many people have questions about this, and so many people have so many different types of questions about how did it affect this group of people? How did it affect that group of people? What I wanted to do was create a project where people could go to a website, pick from some choices, and see what's actually been going on, but also to be able to create some dashboards and things to show people some of the things that we found interesting as well. It's up now. We're continuing to make updates to it. It's on our website, forkingoff.com. You can go straight to it at data.forkingoff.com. It'll allow you to go through. You can look at the numbers for different agencies or different jobs, or you can filter down to just the people who took the deferred resignation. You can see how it affected different classes of employees, all sorts of good stuff. It's got stuff in there about veterans and how they were impacted. It's got data about age ranges and things like that. I encourage people to go check it out, but I also encourage people to let us know if there are things that it doesn't do that you would like to be able to do, or if you have recommendations for how to improve upon it.
Let us know what you think about that. The data, like on the page, Philip tells you exactly where the data came from, how he cleaned up the data. If you got questions, just reach out.
All of the code is on GitHub, so if anybody wants to know exactly what I did, you can learn more there.
Now let's talk about what's going to happen in today's episode. So we're going to be talking with Alec Chapa, who is with Community Relations Service. If you've been listening to us for a while, you'll remember our very first guest was also with Community Relations Service with DOJ, Jordan Matthews. And Jordan told us then that was America's peacemaker. But just to give everybody a little bit of background, Community Relations Service has been around for over 60 years. And they are there to provide assistance to communities and people to resolve disputes and disagreements and difficulties relating to discriminatory practices.
Can you provide some examples of how they've done that?
Well, yeah. One of the oldest examples we have of CRS actually coming in and helping communities is in 1965 when Martin Luther King Jr. staged the March in Selma. And just days after Alabama state troopers and local cops assaulted protesters in Bloody Sunday, CRS were the officials who came in and worked with the community to avert another round of violence. They were there to soothe tensions and to get people to come together and to listen to one another. At the beginning of 2025, CRS had 57 employees nationwide. According to OPM data, 47 of those employees left or were removed from government service.
57 already doesn't seem like enough for a whole country to be the peacemaker. To take 47 of them away seems like a big deal.
Yeah, it's a huge deal.
Especially in a year when we've seen so much unrest.
When I was doing a little bit of research on CRS, I found this article by ProPublica. It was in the heat of the George Floyd protests, and CRS was pretty much sidelined during that time. Only a handful of CRS employees were sent to cities that had been experiencing unrest, and there were very few public statements made. And ProPublica pointed out that critics were stating that this muted response reflected the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle CRS and to leave it short-staffed and rudderless was the word they used. So in the first Trump administration, CRS had seen some trouble and had seen some roadblocks put up.
I think I remember Jordan making reference to something like that.
But then in 2021, when the Derek Chauvin trial and the sentencing came about, CRS was there to help ease those tensions and to facilitate those discussions, but they had not been allowed before. So there was a little foreshadowing, but to now see, in light of all of this unrest, with all of this turmoil in our country, to know that the people that would normally be there and would be facilitating those conversations, they're just gone.
Right. So after, the murder, I'll just say it, of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, that absolutely would have been the time for, and especially when the state was saying we want to be involved in these investigations and the federal government is pushing them away and saying no, that seems like a situation where mediation would be helpful. But as we've seen, and as Alec will go into much more in the interview, mediation is a two-way thing.
You have to want to be there. And I don't see that want on the side of the government.
To me, CRS is the perfect signal that the federal government has no interest right now in communicating with the public, with communities, with the people who make up this country, with the people from whom they derive their power.
I found this quote, and it was from Ronald Wakabayashi. He was a regional director for CRS years ago, but he had stated, if you can get a conversation started, things are less likely to go stupid. And I mean, it kind of makes you laugh, but it's so right on the money. It's so right on the nose. We should not be.
We went full stupid.
Idiocracy is real. Okay. Well, on that note, I think it's a really good time for us to pivot to the interview with Alec and hear what he has to say.
All right.
Hi, Alec.
Hi, good to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Why don't we go ahead and jump in? Give us your bluff, your bottom line up front.
All right. So I'm Alec Chapa. I was a conciliator at Community Relations Service under the Department of Justice, and now I run a dispute resolution firm, Mosaic Collaborative Consulting. I took the second deferred resignation offer.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Like, what led you to public service? How'd you get there?
Well, I'll try not to dump out my whole background here. Ever since I was young, I was a student of philosophy. I really pursued that all the way up until undergrad. So philosophy, world religions, humanities, all about the human condition, especially getting people to think and convene together for discussions. That was endlessly fascinating. It continues to be. After a first run in undergrad with an Illinois college, I just wanted a more, honestly, intense education experience. I wanted to give it everything I had. I wanted to get out of that experience everything that I put into it. And I found that in a private mentorship with Philosopharian in a tiny little coastal town, Astoria, Oregon. For those of you out there that have seen The Goonies, it was filmed there. So that's a cool little bit of trivia. Philosopharian's a nonprofit.
Nice.
Yeah, they're a nonprofit out there. And, I followed that dream and that's where it took me.
Wow. That's cool. So you ended up at Community Relations Service. So was that like your first job out of college? Did you do other things before then? How did you end up there?
After studying philosophy and world religions, that's when the 2016 election cycle was happening. So in that period of transition, because I took a gap year between studying philosophy and conflict resolution, there was this big intersection, right, where I had a gap year. I could really think about what I wanted to do with my career and my studies. And I had already put so much into it. And I was witnessing what we were all witnessing, right? This mass civil unrest. The short of the long is I had to do something about that. I couldn't just stand by and watch while all of this unrest was happening. And, I was a young man at the time, 19, 20, 21, watching this happen. Like, I've never known, civic life to be like that. So I decided to major in conflict resolution down the road at Portland State University. And a lot of that kind of intersected as well with kind of philosophy of Gandhi and civil disobedience. How is it that we organize and produce change and ultimately resolve our conflicts without using violence, right? And so fast forward, I came back to San Antonio after graduating. I published some research in the field. I worked a couple different jobs while I was consulting on the side. And about, 5 years into doing that, I was offered the job at DOJ.
Very cool. So tell us a little bit about your job at DOJ. What did you do at Community Relations Service? We have talked with Jordan before, so we got a little bit of that, but what did you do there?
Yeah, so I was a conciliator, which, we simply define as the mediation component. CRS, Community Relations Service, is the mediation component of DOJ. So there very much is an iron curtain between the investigative and the prosecutorial parts of the Department of Justice. So sometimes I would think to myself, well, this is a very different phone call, a conciliator calling a mayor or a police chief or something like that than it would be for the attorney general or one of their staff. It's just a very different kind of conversation, and I think that really is best described through the pillars of the service. So it's impartial, right? Okay, that's pretty straightforward, but it's also confidential, like it would be in any mediation. So it's a private conversation, and we don't produce any kind of corroborating evidence of any kind. Like I said, there's an iron curtain there. And voluntary and free, of course, publicly funded. The voluntary part is huge, right? Because when we engage in these conversations that are often very sensitive because they have to do with public disputes, there's a lot of hesitation usually around engaging. The Department of Justice is the first thing that people hear, no matter how many times you explain forward and backward. I'm a mediator. I'm with CRS. I'm not a litigator. I didn't even get a law degree. So those are the pillars and the services that we offer: training, logistical support, mediation, facilitation. So we're basically giving people the tools, the resources, and then ultimately offering the capacity for dealing with disputes, because most cities, organizations, whatever, public entities it might be, or private, they're not used to dealing with these things, at least not at that scale. So we come in and add the capacity to help them do it, but we do it as third-party impartials. We're not here to tell people what to do, how to do it, whether to engage or not, but we're here to make sure that they have access if they do want to, and to make sure that that access remains peaceful.
That is cool. And it seems so very needed. And I know it was formed through the Civil Rights Act, and today there's not much of community relations service, if anything at all, is still there. So how would these tools have been used in this environment?
Thank you for that question. There's a number of different ways that it could be used. I'll humble myself and condition my answer based on the fact that I was still very much in new conciliator training. It's not that I don't know what mediation is. I do it for a living. I've been doing it for years. That being said, it's a different kind of thing when doing it for the federal government, or folks that are very worried about, are we being investigated, right? And so that perception is not superficial. It's very central and foundational to the work. So that's the first condition. And the second condition, before I speak, is it really comes down to the communities. What do they want? How do they see their role? What are their objectives and goals? What are their concerns? What are all of these things? And I can't know that from the outset and from the outside. So I can imagine a couple different ways that it would maybe go and probably look, but I'll just say that. So what I imagine communities would want is to, first of all, just establish clarity. There's so much lack of transparency around what happened in Minneapolis. In fact, I wrote all about this in my recent publication with the Fed Up, but transparency was severely lacking. There was massive discrepancies between the video that people could see, regardless of their widespread perceptions about it, and what the officials were saying at one time, and then what they said a week later, and 2 and 3 weeks later, et cetera. So the clarity to make up for that lack of transparency is huge. And the other thing I would say, without going too much in depth, is fair process. People want to know, if you apply for a job application, for example, I'm making a simple example, but it's the same principle. They want to know what criteria will be used to assess their candidacy. That's part of how it feels fair. If people don't know what the dimensions are in the process, if it feels like a black box, that is going to produce a lack of trust.
And I would imagine in this situation, there has been a lot of conflict between the individuals in the community and the federal agents that are present, but there's also been conflict between the community leaders, right? The chief of police in Minneapolis has been very outspoken. The mayor has been outspoken. The governor. That seems like an area where community relations services would have been really well positioned to build trust faster between those local officials and federal officials to try and maybe build a bridge there that they could use to extend outreach into the community. Is that sort of one of the things that we would have expected?
Absolutely. Added capacity for the back end for, like you mentioned, Phil, the intragroup conflicts can be very beneficial for the community. So giving everyone the ability to, the local officials to make sure they're on the same page, they're pursuing the same strategy for the same objectives. That's critical, right? Before they send out a message that may very well be at odds with another agency or another official up the chain of command, right? So that's really big, especially when you have different entities, right? You've got local, state, and federal. I'm not going to say they're necessarily pursuing different objectives, but at least the perception to perceive that is certainly there, which means there's a risk, there's potential for fear, there's all these things. And that's where we come in and say, hey, we understand what the sensitivities are. What can we do? How can we help as people that don't have a horse in the race to make sure everyone's, unified?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I just think those open lines of communication are so important and so needed. At least it feels like to me, those lines of communication have all been blocked, if not completely shut down in some cases. It's a sad thing to watch and to try and figure out how we can get involved as well. But going back to community relations service and your job there, so you said you took the second deferred resignation. So why did you choose to take the deferred resignation?
I was forced out, full stop. I was forced out.
Feel that.
I tried tooth and nail. Yeah, I tried tooth and nail to stay, like many of my colleagues did. I mean, I think this is true for anyone of public service. We're dedicated to the mission. We believe in the work. One of the first things that I was told at the beginning was, we know you could be making a lot more money in the private sector. Thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing your talents.
We've all heard that.
Yeah. So, that sense of civic duty is definitely there for me. And especially for CRS, every conciliator comes in with a unique story. I mean, people don't kind of wake up and say, I want to run headfirst into conflict. And most people don't even know that there's a conflict resolution degree or field, et cetera. So all that is to say that I absolutely wanted to be there. I was not going to let that go at the first sign of trouble or the first offer to leave, especially, in a kind of throw up your hands type of way. So the first DRP came around and it was basically an eye roll. I said, no big deal. This is like another credit card offer in the mail. Rip it up and throw it away. Thanks, have a good one. Yeah, whatever. And I thought nothing of it. It was shocking in the sense of what's happening. What does this mean for the Merit Systems Protection Board? There's all these questions that are absolutely there. But in terms of what am I going to do about it? No, nothing at all, right? Just go about your business. Remain loyal to the Constitution, my oath, the mission of the agency. So hard pass. But after that, the risks just continued to grow. We're watching everything happening with USAID and other organizations. The list goes on and on, right? Put them in trauma is what we want to do. I felt in many ways between the first and the second DRP, like I had been hit by a car and I was hanging on the roof. And I know this from experience. I've literally been hit by a car. I was hanging on the roof. And the officials were just swerving wildly left to right while I was hanging on. We were all hanging on. And it was this wild experience. As the risk grew, that's when not only the considerations, but the objective reality started to change. My BATNA, my WATNA, for those negotiation folks out there, that started to change. And as it did, it just ultimately ended up being something where I couldn't afford the risk of staying and everything that could mean.
Yeah, that's, like you said, you have to weigh your risks, you have to weigh your options and do what's best for you, even when that's not really what you want to do.
Yeah.
So what are you doing now? What have you been doing?
Yeah, so I took the DRP in April. I went back into development mode for my private business, Mosaic Collaborative Consulting. And the history of that was all kinds of disputes and capacity building services. And then over the years, especially 23, 2024, and when I resumed back in 2025, I started to niche down and focus and really offer more development and research in the field of housing dispute resolution. So I ended up producing a novel program called HousingShield, now since trademarked. What it is we offer proactive dispute resolution for housing providers and their residents, including between residents themselves, so roommates, neighbors. The idea there is if we can get in early, we can make services fast, affordable, and pretty streamlined, then it makes a lot of sense for threats to housing stability. So yeah, Housing Shield is my main focus. It's been a few years in development now, and we have like 6,000 plus units now kind of under contract. So we provide services for those folks, and yeah, anywhere we're needed otherwise.
That is really cool. Especially in today's economy where we've seen kind of a downturn. We've seen its affordability has definitely impacted the housing market. I know here in LA, it is wildly expensive here. And we live in an area that has rent control, which means you have some issues with landlords not wanting to give the proper care to certain units because somebody's been living there for 30 years. And so they're not paying as much in rent as somebody else. It's very difficult to be able to maintain that habitability.
And litigation is expensive, right?
Ooh.
So
Mhm.
finding an
Mhm.
alternative to that, not just a money saver, but I think as you've hit on several times, people don't necessarily want to move out of their homes when things like this happen, right? But if you sue somebody, like that trust that's a hard thing to get back. Whereas through the mitigation process, the mediation process, that seems like it would help to make sure you're not just finding a way to stay, but you're also rebuilding trust. And that's something that I think you mentioned it when I was reading your article with Jordan, like these lessons extend to all types of conflict. It's not just housing. It's the same lessons that we could learn right now with the government, finding ways to build that trust to enter into these mediation type agreements would probably help a lot all over.
That's exactly right. The mitigation process, I'm glad that you bring up that framing because that is a lot of the framing that I use. We don't want risks to come up and we try to anticipate them as best as we can. And then we just kind of cross our fingers and hope it doesn't rain today, right? But sooner or later they come up. That's how it works. That's how the math pencils out. And when that happens, most people are not in a position to be able to just absorb those risks. You know, Jill, you bring up LA, the rent board, the rent control. I've actually, handled hundreds of disputes out of the San Francisco area, so I'm very familiar with how that looks. And I see the tension on the one hand between the approach taken in places like California with strong renter protections and then places like Texas where it's quite the opposite. And, it's not to say that one's better than the other, there are pros and cons, but you see the tensions come up in different ways. So in a place like San Antonio without rent ordinances, renters are feeling a lot of the pressure. And how that might show up is a renter that, is paying more than the HUD recommended 30% or of their income on their unit. They really can't afford it, but they're stuck in place. They're frozen, as it were, because they can't afford the first and last or the security deposit to move out. So this is like a kind of a latent risk. And then here comes one surprise medical bill or, losing your job like many of us did in the DRP or whatever else it might be, a divorce, a breakup, you name it. And now all of a sudden that issue is spiraling because it was like, a forest fire, with a lot of ground shrubbery, and it becomes the landlord's problem. So we get in there as soon as it happens and put it out quick, as fast as possible.
I love that. Getting ahead of a problem is absolutely the best way.
I think the putting out the fire early analogy really connects here in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Yeah, I know some folks out there, and it's a tough situation. But yeah, mediation has kind of helped come to the rescue. As a matter of fact, one of the first things I thought about after feeling the grief of all the fires in LA, I thought to a couple years ago about the fires in Hawaii. Hawaii has a massive mediation program set up just for these fires and dealing with the aftermath, right? Because the litigation literally would balloon to never end. In fact, that's exactly what we saw with the Baltimore Bridge. The litigation amounts, and then the cost of pursuing resolution adds so much to the cost that it's a compounding effect and you never get ahead of it, right? So mediation becomes critical to dealing with these things.
Absolutely. So you're doing great things now. It's really positive. But would you ever go back to federal service, to public service?
Yeah, I mean, the first, I just have to like sigh of relief, but then also sigh of like hesitation.
I know.
I think the feeling there is almost more important than the thoughts, but conditionally, yes, I would do it if the conditions were right. And I say that not just for personal reasons around how I was left and the sour taste and, the relief of leaving and the thought of going back, given the sour taste in my mouth. Even all of that aside, my role as a conciliator and in the environment of dealing with public trust as a mediator, a servant to that public trust, I'm in a very sensitive kind of position. The conditions have to just be right. There's an analogy here where if folks haven't seen the movie Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks, I highly recommend it. It really captures kind of the spirit of what we do. And it's based on a true story. I won't give the plot away, but it's a fantastic movie about how it is that we kind of work across differences, especially when there is no existing structure for doing so, or when that existing structure has been compromised, kind of like we're seeing now. So it comes back to trust, what you can find that the other side values and how you can work with that. So coming back to the DRP, I think that the public trust has to be there and the situation has to kind of be ripe for service. There's a lot of disputes that mediation isn't appropriate for, or at least not yet, at least not in that particular phase. For example, I'll just bring up a simple one. If a case has yet to be filed, it's very ripe for mediation. No attorneys, no discovery happening. Once it's been filed, discovery is happening. And very often mediation can be used as a kind of data mining, right? Let's just, get the other side to tip their hand. We'll see what they're working with, and then we'll nail them, right? So after a certain amount of that discovery has happened, then it becomes possible to negotiate in good faith and produce a real durable solution, but not before. And so I think the same kind of thing is happening where we just need to see a certain level of public reckoning, whatever that may look like. I don't know. That's for the people to decide, collectively, but with more trust in the process and an understanding of what really mediation is and why it matters. Under those conditions, I would go back.
This sounds like a theme that we've heard from a lot of people is, it's going to take a lot of change before it feels like a safe thing to do. But I like the way that you're framing it. I think there comes a point when hopefully we are through this and we're ready to rebuild as a country. And there's a lot of trust that has been broken, both between communities and their governments, but also between us as a country and our partners around the world. There is a future where there's a lot of opportunity to try and rebuild that, and mediators would be a huge part of that. I can't even begin to think of all of the ways that would be really important. But you're right. If it comes too soon, it's almost like it won't feel authentic. It's like, okay, well, we did 4 years of that. Now let's all make up and do 4 years of something else. Like, no, it's not going to be that easy. There's going to have to be some things that change before that really feels like something people can put trust in.
Absolutely. I mean, case in point, if a mediator shows up, they are fully qualified, there are no conflicts of interest, they're the perfect mediator on paper, but the parties don't, for whatever reason, trust them, it cannot work, full stop. So I could show up and say, hey, I've done this before. I've been a conciliator and I work with people, of all different kinds of ideologies and persuasions and religions and walks of life. I can do this. They still have to kind of appoint me, as it were. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm just not going to be an effective mediator.
Merriam-Webster should probably make it the word of the year, retribution, right? It's been the theme of this administration, but a lot of people are already talking about how one day there will need to be retribution for what is going on now, and that's not the right environment for mediation.
I will say this. Some level of reconciliation needs to happen. I think it's a fitting term that we were called conciliators and not mediators. A lot of the transformation that happens in mediation, it comes back to a fundamental recognition that we can't change the past. We can start to make the future, but it starts with accepting that we can't change the past. Whatever that may look like, small claim, mediation, the tenant pays everything plus mediation fees, or the landlord pays for the move out, or in these mass cases, it could look like all kinds of things. January 6 prosecutions, it can look like truth and reconciliation panels. It can look like the release of files that otherwise would have been held confidential. It could look like all kinds of things, but we have to determine that in ways that are creative, forward-looking, not in ways that remain looking backward, because otherwise the shadow of the past holds the future hostage.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, so I did a study abroad in Tanzania. We attended the Rwandan genocide trials that were being held there in Arusha, right? And it's very different, but there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from that in a time like this. And there, the important thing that all of the locals emphasized was that, Western justice can't be the answer to an African conflict. There are very different expectations of what reconciliation looks like and, how they move forward. And I think whatever does come of this has to come in a form that makes sense to Americans and broadly appeals to an American sense of justice.
Yeah, I love that you bring up the international component because I know very little about international relations. I never studied it. I keep an eye on these things now, recognizing the very real impact that these things have. Learning from the lessons of our neighbors through some of these studies and the forced sacrifices that they've had to make is a very wise thing to do. And I think that any country can benefit from doing that, especially us as Americans. What do our neighbors to the east and west, north and south have to teach us about these things so that we don't have to go through them if we don't have to?
Yeah. Well, Alec, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we sign off today?
I just want to leave it on a more positive note. I am myself and am a very optimistic person and very relentlessly so. I'm a stubborn optimist. And I say that from a sense of pragmatic optimism, right? We still have to make these things work. We can't just live in dreamland. Continue to see the good in the people to the left and to the right of you, regardless of whatever uniforms they might wear or persuasions they may have. That's how the best of us are brought about, right? That's how our better angels come out. And these people that we may disagree with, they still have power over our communities, whether we like them or not. So it really would be wise of us to engage them all the same. So just continue to see the better parts of your colleagues and your neighbors.
Thank you. I like that. Thank you so much. All right. Well, Alec, thanks for joining us today and thanks for working off with us.
All right. Well, that was good. I enjoyed that.
I know, right?
Since we talked to Alec, there was a whistleblower complaint involving CRS.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. There was a former senior official from Community Relations Service filed a whistleblower complaint stating that the Department of Justice had misled a federal court by failing to turn over internal warnings that dismantling CRS was legally indefensible and operationally impossible. Representative Jamie Raskin sent a letter to Pam Bondi, AG Pam Bondi, on March 12th of this year, which was a couple of weeks after we talked with Alec. Representative Raskin actually stated in his letter, CRS was built for exactly the kind of moment we are living through. Before the administration dismantled it, CRS had a full-time specialist in Minnesota and could have surged additional conciliators from across the Midwest within hours. CRS could have been on the ground with impartial mediators as crises unfolded in Minneapolis and could have served as the confidential peacemakers Congress designed them to be.
Huh.
Right? Like, that's it. That states it all right there. That is the group that we need in a time like we are living through.
Absolutely. Instead, it's pretty clear that the federal government is not willing to actually engage with communities.
Yeah, but we were talking about, like, so what to look for. So is the Department of Justice actually going to give a reasonable response to this? I don't think we're going to see that, seeing as how they're starting cases against nonprofits. They're investigating all of these random things.
Yeah, I think there will definitely be more of these 2339 cases, these material support cases against rioters or even peaceful protesters at some point. They won't stop with people who were doing graffiti. They'll come up with something.
And most of the protests that we have seen have been peaceful. But for the government to basically say, we don't want to come to the table, you just need to do what we say.
Yeah. And that's the message.
That is the message. And we can hope for the courts to intervene, but going through the court system takes a long time.
And it assumes that the final outcome will be something that the administration will comply with, which we've already seen. They will just find some excuse to do it in a slightly different way and start the clock over.
But, we don't just have to sit around.
No.
And we don't have to just sit and watch.
Nope.
We can actually do things
that don't involve burning Waymos.
Yes, that do not involve burning Waymos, that don't involve, spraying graffiti unless you've been paid to paint a mural.
Is that graffiti? If you were paid to, I think that's just called art.
I mean, you're a graffiti artist, though.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know.
Somebody
wants to let us know in the comments.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Someone let us know. But there are things you can do. Anna Mitchell was so right. Get involved with your community and use social media. Use what is at your disposal to share legitimate news with others, because you don't know who's going to see that, and they know you and they trust you, and they may come back and they may ask you, hey, can you tell me more about this? It's little pieces along the way that will help us all come together. So we were talking earlier, and I was saying, oh yeah, I read this thing where somebody was talking about social media, and they were like, Martin Luther and Alexander Hamilton, they used the social media of the day. Martin Luther nailed his thesis on the church door. That's where people would go to read the news, read the cool things that were going on. And Alexander Hamilton would write essays, and people would pass them out.
I love this plan. I have a hammer. I have nails. Let's go.
Okay. We don't have to go nail things on doors right now.
Okay.
But you got Insta, you got Threads, you got Blue Sky. You can put things out there for people to see.
As a matter of fact, they even wrote the Federalist Papers in pseudonym. Nobody knew who the original authors were at the time. That's great. Just like Anonymous.
Maybe a little different.
Yeah, a little different.
So there are things you can do, like use your voice. But Philip, what else can we do?
Alec had a lot of really good suggestions and insight himself. I think the most important thing he said is there's going to come a time for reconciliation. And that word is really important. There have been a lot of R words thrown around. A lot of people have talked about retribution. I want to make a case for removing the word retribution from our lexicon, and especially from journalism. Because a lot of people have been calling what the Trump administration is doing retribution. When we actually look at that word, it's an old-fashioned form of justice. It's out of style. I'm not advocating for it, but it's an eye for an eye. You committed a wrong, and therefore an equal punishment will be imposed upon you.
So Old Testament style.
Yeah, which I think we learned was not the best way to go about justice. But even then, that assumes that there was a valid wrong committed that warranted some sort of punishment. That's not what's been going on. What's been going on? It's revenge. This is Trump and his friends getting back at all the people who he feels like have wronged him. Reconciliation is different. Reconciliation is actually looking for a way to make sure that everyone who has been aggrieved is able to feel like a sense of justice has come. It's done in a measured way. That's where we need to be going. And I want to highlight another thing that Alex said. He said to engage with the people who have power over us. And that's extremely important. It's what you just talked about, directly addressing the challenges that we face through platforms like social media. You can at your heart out at federal social media accounts. It's not going to do anything. But within your communities, there's your local government, your local police, there's your state government. You probably have some sort of state police and investigative service. Now is a very good time for people to actually start getting engaged with them, getting engaged with their congresspeople, because that communication is what is important. And it's also what is going to someday inform that reconciliation process. It's what's going to make sure that when the time comes to make the plan, to do the things, that they have the information. Another thing, start collecting evidence for when that time comes as well. When you see some crazy video online about some wrong that was committed, it's probably going to get deleted. Make a copy. Write down where you got it from. Keep notes.
Philip will be happy to provide a training for you if you would like to learn how to do this.
Yeah, there are a lot of good resources that people can use to do those kinds of things, but it is going to be very important someday that there's actual physical evidence to support those types of efforts.
And firsthand accounts. Write it down, take a video, do whatever. It's
do a voice note.
It's something that Philip and I have felt very strongly about, and that's why we're doing this podcast, is to record what is happening while it's happening.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got opportunities to use our voice. Like Alex said, we should be looking to people locally who have power. We should start engaging with them. We should start being part of the dialogue, being part of that conversation. Start being aware of what has been happening to know what could be restored, and make a record for yourself. History is going to need it.
One more time for the record. Hammer and nails, yes or no?
I'm going to go with no.
Okay.
I'm going to go with no. I think you can stick to the social media platforms we have.
Okay.
All right. Well, everyone, have a great month, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for forking off with us.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.